So, hello, good evening, and welcome to the 2025 CIW Annual Lecture. My name is Ben Hillman, and I'm the Director of the Australian Centre on China in the World. We're meeting here tonight for this 2025 CIW Annual Lecture on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend a special welcome to First Nations people joining us at this event tonight. I'd also like to welcome colleagues from across campus, from across the lake, friends from DFAT and other parts of Australian government, members of the public, and also a special welcome to colleagues from across Australia who've travelled to be here with us tonight, from as far away as Curtin, UWA, Adelaide, Melbourne, Monash, UTS, UNSW, Sydney, UTAS, Griffith, Bond, La Trobe, and UQ. Am I missing anyone? Big welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us here tonight. We're delighted you could be here for this event and for the discussions that will follow during our workshop tomorrow on how we can promote China studies and China literacy in Australia. And we're very fortunate to have such a distinguished guest to kickstart this conversation by sharing his insights on the evolution of China studies in the USA. Professor David Shambaugh needs no introduction to most people in this audience. He is an internationally recognised authority and award-winning author on contemporary China and the international relations of Asia. He's Gaston Ségur Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science and International Affairs and Director of the China Policy Program at the George Washington University. He's also held positions at the Foreign Policy Studies Program at the Brookings Institution and the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He also served in the US Department of State and National Security Council during the Carter administration, on the board of directors of the National Committee on US-China Relations, the Advisory Council of the National Bureau of Asian Research, the East-West Center Fellowship Board. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and other public policy and scholarly organisations. Professor Shambaugh, before joining George Washington University, was lecturer, senior lecturer and reader in Chinese politics at the University of London Schools of Oriental and African Studies. From 1988 to 1996, where he also served as editor of the China Quarterly, which on behalf of the editorial team of the China Journal, who are all here tonight, I'm pleased to say continues to be a very good journal. So, David, big welcome to ANU and to CIW, and we really look forward to your talk this evening.
First of all, thank you all for coming out on this cold, rainy Canberra winter evening. And also those who will watch it online. Thanks for coming. And Ben, I really have to begin just by thanking you for not just the generous introduction, but especially for the kind invitation to deliver this year's annual CIW Annual Lecture. I'm really most fortunate to join a very distinguished set of previous annual lecture speakers and colleagues. In fact, the last 2 years, in particular, your speakers were very close to me. Last year's speaker, Scott Kennedy, is one of my star PhD students. And the previous year's speaker, Jean Oy, was a classmate, a PhD classmate of mine at the University of Michigan, and has been a close friend ever since. So it's nice to come in their footsteps. And indeed, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. It's not my first visit to Australia, but believe it or not, it is my first visit to CIW. I've heard about this magnificent building for a number of years. So I'm very pleased to see it in person. And Ben, judging from your website, I'm really must congratulate you and CIW on the range of activities and all the really good and important work that you do here. I must say, ever since I was a graduate student and had the unique opportunity to serve as China Quarterly editor, which was my first visit to Australia, where I first met John Unger, and there he is. And we two editors compared notes, and here we are, John, all these years later. But the China Journal is going strong. In fact, I think is now the top-ranked China Studies journal in the world, so congratulations on that. A great achievement, and I'm a consumer. So tonight, well, I've had a long-standing, throughout my career really, beginning in graduate school, interest in our field as a field and how it's evolved. And I thought when you extended the nice invitation to speak this evening, it might be an opportunity to talk about the evolution of the contemporary China field in the United States. Contemporary meaning in temporal terms post-1949, because it might interest you comparatively how the American field has evolved in comparison with Australian China studies, which has always been, along with the UK, in my view, the top three countries in the world for China studies. So what I'd like to do this evening is provide in less than an hour, I was told, an overview of the evolution of the contemporary China studies field in the United States for you, but particularly for younger people here who may not have a sense of how the field has evolved previously. And then at the end, I will conclude with some observations about where the field is today and the challenges it faces in the US, but indeed worldwide. I have some PowerPoint slides, visual aids. Let me begin by identifying 5 broad influences that I think have helped to shape, drive, condition the field of contemporary China studies in the US. The point here is that the field of contemporary China studies has been a reactive field, reacting to these 5 stimuli. Reactive, as you can see for yourselves, first to events in China, reactive to theories and changes in the social science disciplines, reactive to domestic American politics, reactive to the state of US-China relations, and finally reactive to major events in world affairs, such as the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and other East European communist systems. So at least these 5. There are no doubt more, but I'd like to single out these 5 and then drill down a little bit into each one. So the first feature illustrates what I'd say is the sort of the demand pull or the demand signal from the media, from government, from NGOs, from civil society and the general public in the United States for informed analyses and explanations about events in China. So the China scholarly academic field has reacted to those communities, those non-academic communities' need for information and analysis about China. China scholars are called upon to interpret current events for multiple audiences, but to do so effectively really requires that they leave their academic jargon behind, describe complex phenomena in China in a kind of intellectually understandable terms, and explain real-world implications for their non-academic audiences. Not many academics can do this. but I think it's important for them to try. Many senior China scholars from the 1970s through the 1980s performed this valuable public intellectual role, and some of their names I'm sure are very familiar to you. I'll just note a few: Doak Barnett, Ezra Vogel, Robert Scalapino, Michael Oxenberg, my mentor, Mike Lampton, Kenneth Lieberthal, also my professor, Richard Baum, Harry Harding, and Susan Shirk all come to mind. Indeed, there are others, but there are these are exemplary public intellectuals and leading scholars. That's the first stimulus, is the demand from the public, and indeed the government, the U.S. government, for knowledge about China. That has changed. The government is not as interested in academics' views as they once were. And, but the second stimuli is or I should say, are the analytical tools of different academic disciplines that have impacted the study of China. This is true in other fields too, but indeed, ever since the so-called behavioral revolution of the 1960s, China has been something of a laboratory for different disciplinary scholars to experiment, you might say, and test their theories and methods that are developed in their disciplines, social science disciplines. Now, whether this has helped to clarify or obscure the object of analysis, namely China, remains debatable. But indeed, the China field has been reactive to the disciplinary stimuli. And thus, I think American scholarship on China has always been what you might call a borrower field, borrowing concepts and methodological techniques developed for the study of other countries and applied to China. So it's never been really a producer field conceptually. China studies have been importers, but not exporters. Precious few concepts developed in the study of China have been picked up more broadly in comparative politics or other social science disciplines, which is an oddity. You know, China borrows from others, but doesn't give back, so to speak, or others don't borrow from China studies. So there have been rather eclectic sets of influences. I'm going to come to this slide, and then I'll come back. Go to the next slide, and then come back. Okay, so here are some of the eclectic paradigms that have influenced China studies and China scholars have borrowed from over time. But they illustrate how China studies has really borrowed from each of these. In, American political studies, the concept of clientelism, Soviet studies and comparative communism, from European studies, the concept of civil society, Latin American studies, amongst other things. We've learned, those of us who study the military, we borrow in the civil military literature from Latin America, and others, modernization, organization theory, etc. I just don't want to go through this. I just want to tag these as illustrative examples of inputs for the China field. Okay, let me come back, if I can, then to this slide. So the third stimuli has been the domestic political climate in the United States, which has had, at various times, very real and often very deleterious impacts on the field. China studies has certainly not always been walled off as an ivory tower field from the broader society and politics of the United States. It would be odd if it was. But the most notable, perhaps, examples, first negative example was in the early 1950s with the McCarthy period and the so-called House Un-American Activities Committee, which Senator McCarthy led that impugned and destroyed the careers of a number of China specialists, cast aspersions on the entire profession, and stunted the growth of the field, precisely at a time when knowledge about the new People's Republic was most needed. The second time when domestic politics affected the field was during the Vietnam War of the 1960s, when some China scholars were accused of active or complicit cooperation with the US government, and hence the war effort and American imperialism in Asia. These critics formed and used as a platform the Committee on Concerned Asian Scholars, CCAS. So, whereas the China field in the 50s was attacked from the right, you might say, under McCarthyism, during the 60s, the field was attacked from the left by the CCAS. So the China scholars have been impacted and impugned at various times. And it didn't end with the Vietnam War, I dare say. After the Nixon opening, excuse me, in 1972, all the way through the late 1990s, the field had a bit of a respite from the domestic environment, political environment. But in the 90s, another round of attacks was launched from the right against many China hands who were criticized for being naive and soft on China. They were labeled as the people who did the attacking were labeled themselves as the blue team, and the China specialists were labeled the red team, not because they studied red China, but it's a concept that comes out of war games, right? Red versus blue. So the China experts were accused for not being alert to, if not intentionally covering up, the so-called China threat. The underlying premise of which assumption was that, unlike Soviet specialists who tended to hate their object of study, their accusation was China specialists were, loved their country, China, so to speak, and were not critical enough and not dispassionate enough. That was the accusation, that they were intrinsically sympathetic to communist China. So that was in the 90s. This critique led to a full-blown set of criticisms against the engagement policy of China by the so-called blue team, which were a series of journalists primarily, and some in the Congress. They argued that the engagement strategy of China was naive, misplaced, and inappropriate for American foreign policy, and that the China specialists were complicit in that engagement policy. So that was a third instance of when domestic American politics impacted the field. And so I'll leave it at that. In recent years, we've had some similarities to that, some echoes, I should say, to that, those attacks of the 90s. More recently, as the US-China relationship has become more strained, China specialists are, again, under a microscope, and their writings and their public discussions are being carefully examined by House Representatives committees and others. So we're kind of in another, hasn't become quite another McCarthy period now, but it has some similarities. So the fourth influence is the state of US-China relations. Now, during the 50s and the 60s, of course, China was the incipient enemy of the United States. And during these two Cold War decades, China was therefore studied as an adversarial object to be understood, countered, and undermined. was the case, as was the case, I should say, with the Soviet Union, study of the Soviet Union. This was a period of so-called comparative communism. When I went through graduate school, we took courses on comparative communism. And China was studied as one of many communist states. It was not sui generis, okay? And so one could say that the Cold War was a boon to China studies, just as it was to Soviet studies. Know your enemy. A lot of resources flowed into the field from the US government, but also private foundations to understand the adversary. Okay, now the field after the Cold War, though, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, China was, you might say, detached from that paradigm. Now, the US-China relationship, continued to evolve, hardly steadily, but the engagement policy was still the overarching American governmental approach to China. I have a brand new book out just last week, in fact, called Breaking the Engagement, How China Won and Lost America, because the engagement policy died about 10 years ago. We can come back to that later if you're interested. But during this longer period of time, when the engagement policy was being carried out from administrations from Nixon through Obama, the field generally developed positively. And, but once Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and the broader US-China relationship has significantly deteriorated since that time, American scholars of China have been impacted by Xi Jinping's and the Chinese regime's various policies, which is something I'm going to return to at the end of the lecture tonight. What is the state of opportunities or lack thereof for researching China, as it has become quite closed. This is the most closed China has been to Americans since prior to 1979 in the normalization of relations, not just Americans. And I would be very interested to hear from you all how Australian scholars, what they're experiencing in trying to do real on-the-ground research in China. So the US-China relationship has been a driver, for better or for worse. And then lastly, major events in world affairs. The Cold War, Vietnam War, to be sure, impacted the field. The Tiananmen Uprising of 1989, followed by the collapse of communist regimes like dominoes, boom, 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 in Eastern Europe, and finally the big domino, the Soviet Union, imploded. No, it didn't implode. It was overthrown. We keep talking about the Soviet collapse. No, the Soviet Communist Party was overthrown by its people and Yeltsin. So anyway, 1991, major event, affected China studies. And subsequently, after a brief interregnum, well, after that interregnum, the field began to look at China again in comparative terms relative to those collapsed communist parties. Martin Dimitrov is here tonight. He's done some very good work on this. There he is. And I myself wrote a book called China's Communist Party Atrophy and Adaptation. So we were trying to figure out where does China fit on this arc of collapsed or overthrown communist regimes. So that period, the early 90s, late 89 to 92, had a real impact. Then subsequently, the so-called rise of China and China going global became phenomenon to study in themselves. And I wrote a whole book about China going global. So the point here is that China has been reactive to all five of these factors. But there's one other factor that I think has also affected American contemporary China studies. And that is, unlike in Europe and perhaps here in Australia, I don't know. But unlike in Europe, in the United States, there has never been a strong requirement for grounding in historical, cultural, and linguistic sinology. There is no such thing in the United States as sinology with a capital S. It does not exist. This is a European concept. We call it China studies. Now, but what's that really mean? Well, that means that in American China studies, all one basically needs is fluency in the language, especially with simplified characters, and training in a discipline. As absurd as it sounds, and it is absurd, many contemporary China scholars are so ignorant of Chinese history, they can't even identify the Chinese dynasties in proper sequence, much less hold a knowledgeable conversation about them. As a result, the study of pre-49 China has been left entirely to historians, art historians, philosophers, and others in the humanities. So that's a big difference between American China studies and European China studies. Now, this being the general case, there is some good news. Over the past couple of decades, this sort of 1949 Great Wall, if you want to call it that, has begun to erode, as historians of modern China have crossed the 49 threshold, including diplomatic historians, and they've been producing some really fascinating work about the 1950s and 1960s. So that 1949 was a very arbitrary barrier, and fortunately, historians have moved forward, and some contemporary China scholars have begun to look backwards in time, probing the Republican and the late Qing for different antecedents and patterns that might be applicable to the understanding of communist China today. So this is a good thing. We're taking a longer, at least century-long now, view at China. Some are. But nonetheless, younger scholars today, they aren't looking back that far. Indeed, today's younger generation of scholars don't even have I find, a very good grounding in the 1950s and 60s in China. You ask them about the anti-rightist movement, they go, what? What was that? Great Leap Forward? Okay, so these are the broad influences, the 5 broad influences I think that have affected the American field over time. And let me turn then to how the field has evolved. And I would like to identify 6 what I call generations, phases, which you can see on this slide for yourself. First generation ran from the 1950s through the mid-1960s, the Soviet era. Second generation, and I'll walk you through briefly each of these momentarily. Second generation I call the chaotic era, from the late 60s through the late 70s. In essence, the last 10 years of the Mao era. Third generation, the liberal reform era of the 80s. Fourth, what I call the hard authoritarian era, from 89 to 2002. Fifth period, soft authoritarian era from 2002 to 12. And the last period that we are still in, I call the neo-totalitarian era. Now these eras, if you will, generally coincide with different Chinese leaders, not precisely, but generally the generation 1 is the 1 and 2 are the Mao era. Generation 3, the Deng era. 4, the Jiang Zemin era. 5, the Hu Jintao era. And of course 6, the Xi Jinping era. Now these concepts, or these generations I should say, have to do mainly with events in China. So let me walk you through these, if you can bear with me for a little bit. The first generation, the Soviet era. Now this period, of course, is defined overall by first the copying and then the adapting of the Soviet political and economic model to the new PRC. And I would just point out to you all, as I always do to my students the first day of class, if you want to understand the People's Republic of China, you must understand the Soviet Union first. People's Republic of China has been and still is, to a very large extent, a clone of the Soviet Union. Now, that may shock a lot of you. That's what I believe. Not just the Leninist Party, the planned economy, a lot of dimensions, at least of the state, the party state. Okay, so but back in the 50s, of course, the PRC willingly adopted and adapted, to a certain extent, various Soviet institutions and practices through the decade until the Sino-Soviet split in 1960, we know what happened thereafter. But the American scholarship on this period really focused on the new party state, its institutions, its leaders, and its ideology. They asked what was really new about this new regime, the People's Republic of China? What was really communist about it? What was Soviet-inspired? And what remained uniquely Chinese about the new regime? Like John King Fairbank, for example, said, oh, there's nothing different. I mean, this is a Chinese regime. This is not a Soviet clone. He was wrong, I think. And what these scholars found was, in fact, a near complete cloning of the USSR in the People's Republic. This is not just, some sort of ideological prejudice on the part of Western scholars. It was an empirical fact. With few exceptions, prior to the onset of the Cultural Revolution, the PRC was an organizational replica of the Soviet Union. Everything. Party, government, military, security services, economy, social organizations, educational systems, all Soviet, borrowed from, cloned from the Soviet Union. With some minor adaptations to suit Chinese local conditions and Maoist inclinations. Okay, the other element of the first generation scholarship studied Yundong campaigns. All the Maoist campaigns launched during the 50s and the 60s. And they did so from this place, which John Unger will recognize, the University Services Center, number 14 Argyle Street in Kowloon, right, John? Where John and his lovely wife, is Anita here, John? Did their own PhD research in the 1960s. The University Services Center was established in 1963 and was truly a unique place for China watching. Its particular virtues were that it offered opportunities to interview refugees who'd escaped the mainland from into Hong Kong, and the other thing was the availability of various Chinese mainland media. So the USC, the University Services Center, was really the center, physically, intellectually, and socially, for this, for the first and second generation of contemporary China scholars. And it was born out of circumstance. You had to study China from the periphery, Hong Kong being the periphery, because you couldn't go to China, at least Americans couldn't go to China. And a number of the pioneering studies on communist China were PhD dissertations written at, researched at the USC, including, I believe, Chun Village that John authored. Now, the China Quarterly was established about the same time in 1960 and became the principal outlet, before the Australian Journal of Chinese Affairs was established, for much of this scholarship. This first and second generation had no choice, really, not having physical access to China, but they had no choice but to use the research methods developed in the study of the Soviet Union. scrutinizing central media, monitoring leadership appearances and statements, interviewing refugees and the odd defector, and a kind of variant of what was known as Kremlinology emerged, known as Pekingology. Photographs of leaders were carefully evaluated, who is standing next to whom, who is missing, who is airbrushed out of a photograph. People's Daily and other publications were similarly scrutinized for indications of so-called policy tendencies and factional divisions. How many times was a certain term used in an article? Where were the articles placed on the page? Upper left, lower right? All seemed to have great significance. And occasionally, an alleged or real government or party document would make its way out of mainland China. But the point is that this was a period of having relatively few sources and having to study China from the outside. Now, the second generation, the chaotic era, produced a major shift in the research agenda of contemporary China specialists, and Cultural Revolution, of course, was the stimulus, which swept the country beginning in 1966. Elite politics, the study of elite politics, became even more emphasized as an area of study during the Cultural Revolution, but instead of the previously homogeneous and unified elite that foreign American scholars saw, now all of a sudden the opposite image took hold of intense factionalism, wholesale purges, outpouring of accusations in the Red Guard tabloids against different leaders, purges of many leaders, deaths of many leaders, and of course Maoist ideology was a central focus of this second generation. The second generation also began to study what the Cultural Revolution, the mass turmoil of the Cultural Revolution actually meant for Chinese society. What did it do to the nuclear Chinese family as spouses and family members were split apart, some having to denounce each other? Many were imprisoned, sent to labor camps. May 7th cadre schools were down to the countryside. Universities and schools were shuttered and daily life disrupted. So a number of sociologists, John Unger and Anita and others, Marty White, Andrew Walder, others, really focused on this dimension of the Cultural Revolution, the societal level, not the elite level. And another group began to study Chinese foreign policy, China's Maoist revolutionary diplomacy during this period. There is this belief that China had no foreign policy in the Cultural Revolution. Not true. China very much, its foreign policy reflected and echoed its internal policy. Mao sought to export revolution and support various so-called national liberation movements around the developing world. So that's when the field of Chinese foreign policy really got its start, including by Peter Van Ness, who was here and may still be here in Australia. Is he with us still, Peter? Wonderful book he wrote. But and the last element that was paid attention to during this period was the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military. So the military, PLA, not so much as in terms of its weapons, but as a domestic political actor. So this was a big change for the field. And it's also during this period, interestingly, that the field of China studies in the United States began to be institutionalized at a number of leading universities, thanks to the Ford Foundation, which began to give substantial grants of between $500,000 and $1.2 million per year to 8 different American universities, namely American University, California, Berkeley, Chicago, Columbia, Cornell, George Washington University, mine, Harvard, Michigan, Stanford, Yale, and the University of Washington, Seattle. Sorry, maybe that's 10 or 11. These were the recipients of the Ford money. U.S. government also began to invest in Chinese studies through the National Defense Education Act. A couple of other philanthropic foundations in addition to Ford, namely Rockefeller and Carnegie, began to fund the field, and together all of these sources combined invested approximately $70 million US into Chinese studies during the decade of the 1960s. So the field was literally took off. You can't do, unless you have centers and institutions and money, you can't develop a field. Third generation, the liberal reform era, from the 80s up to the events of 1989. It wasn't so much changes in China that affected scholarship of this generation as much as it was the opportunities offered for the first time for Americans to actually go to China, to physically conduct research in China. We couldn't go before 1979. We were very envious of the Australian, British, Canadian, European, Japanese researchers who did get to go. You all had some juicy insights, and you had a head start. But fortunately, with the normalization of U.S.-China relations in 1979, which coincided with Deng Xiaoping's reform, return to power, and reform and opening policies, that provided a great number of opportunities for all of us, but for the U.S. And that included, for the first time, the ability to interview a wide variety of individuals in China, from officials to ordinary citizens, and to do what's known as participant observation fieldwork, live in a village, live in a factory, or a school, or some locality. And as such, anthropologists and sociologists led the way during this first few years of the early 80s. And a whole variety of social sectors all of a sudden were able to be studied for the first time. Petty entrepreneurs, the so-called Getihu, industrial workers, peasants, migrants, youth, the elderly, intellectuals, students, you name it, and some sociologists was studying them, and political scientists. And for economists, they finally had, with the rehabilitation of the state statistical system, some real data to work with. So this was really an important stimulus. Now, that led to some path-breaking work. One I would note was the Oxenberg-Lieberthal-Lambton concept of fragmented authoritarianism. But other studies of domestic Chinese politics that Susan Shirk, Rick Baum, and others did. Now, with respect to Chinese foreign policy, during this period, researchers were able to interview university and so-called think tank experts, thus stimulating a series of studies of Chinese perceptions of foreign countries. And I, indeed, was one of these people. I wrote my own PhD dissertation on China's America specialists back in the early 80s. But Gilbert Rosman, and wrote about Soviet specialists. There were studies done of China's Japan specialists, European specialists, and so on. So a lot of disciplines benefited: political science, anthropology, sociology, demography, economics, and so on. So the fourth generation, I'm going to leave this slide up there, coincided, generally speaking, with the Jiang Zemin era. And I describe it, at least the first part of it, up through 2002, as the hard authoritarian era. It was definitely hard in the wake of Tiananmen, up to 96, I would say. After 96, Jiang Zemin and Zheng Qinghong and others around him, Wang Huning, begin to undertake a number of reforms, and it begins a transition into what will be the fifth generation, the soft authoritarian era, what I call soft authoritarianism. Now, what's notable about these third and fourth generations of research? Well, they offered a much more nuanced and highly variegated image of China. The extraordinary diversity, complexity, and heterogeneity of contemporary China became increasingly evident. Precisely the opposite perspective of the first and the second generation scholars, who tended to see considerable uniformity across the land. Now, this diversity of research subjects and findings was very natural and mostly for the good. Although I do think it did have one rather negative side effect, in my view, and an increasing inability to aggregate and to generalize. scholars began to know, what you might say, more and more about less and less, and became increasingly micro in their studies. Everybody not only had to, it used to be you had your county, then you had your township, or you had your village. Now it was everybody had their own hutong they had to study. You know, just really excessive disaggregation. And as a result, scholars found it very difficult or didn't even attempt to generalize about China writ large. And as a result, they lost one major audience for their work, namely everybody else who is not a scholar outside the academy. They lost their previous roles as public intellectuals, and they increasingly lost their value to journalists and others in society who used to turn to them for interpretations, the government, journalists, and others. So that's when the field and academics really self-isolated, I would say, from the rest of society. And since then, and to this day, I would argue, they have a very, very insular discourse. With whom? With each other only. Nobody reads our stuff outside this little, what Richard Madsen calls a sect, S-E-C-T. China studies, he says, is a sect. I would agree with him. In fact, it's a series of sects within sects. You know, really very granular and sort of insular. This is also the period, and somewhat the result of, China studies being really impacted by the social science disciplines and theories. So oddly and rather counterintuitively, just at a time when China was becoming more open and influential on the world stage, the micro focus of most research projects, taken together with the disciplinary demands on individuals for tenure and to go up the tenure ladder and receive academic tenure, those two twin effects resulted in the China field, I would argue, becoming more isolated from broader society. Okay, so that's just a personal observation. Maybe not true, but that's what I saw. And then let me just briefly describe the soft authoritarian era. There's no single event that characterizes the onset of the fifth generation. It roughly coincides, as I say, with Hu Jintao as China's leader. When reviewing the scholarship of this period, one is struck by the focus on various social maladies, you might say, in society, which characterized the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era, at the end of which many Chinese blamed called that decade the 10 lost years. The society was kind of a malaise and just a drift. But the research foci of that decade paralleled the increasingly apparent problems in Chinese society: widening income gaps and social inequalities, the worsening environment, deepening corruption, increases in crime and social disorder, ethnic uprisings in Tibet and Xinjiang, more pronounced dissent, declining provision of public goods, public health crises like SARS, natural disasters like the Wenchuan earthquake, land seizures and forced relocations, rising nationalism, and so on. That was the research agenda of the Hu-Wen period. Scholars looked at also property rights, labor rights and contestation, rule of law issues, poverty reduction, the emerging private sector, the impact of foreign direct investment, and other things, foreign policy included. So there was a distinct focus during this period of China studies on China outside of Beijing, outside the Ring Road, you might say, across the country. And a series of studies described China as, quote, fragile or decayed, and the party state as predatory. I have in mind Min Shin-pei's work, but others. Systemically corrupt and incapable of tackling the daunting menu of social economic challenges that the regime faced. And many scholars thought there was a growing kind of perfect storm at the time. There were 180,000 protests a year. According to the Ministry of Public Security, a protest, according to their definition, is 100 people or more. That's a lot of protests. Okay, so That was the 5th generation of scholarship. Nonetheless, much of this 5th generation became increasingly theoretically focused and informed, and it was impressive, you have to say, from a theoretical, conceptual standpoint. But China became, as I said at the outset, a kind of laboratory for social scientists to test their theories from their disciplines or from study of other countries on China. It was an outside-in approach. Okay, so again, it illustrates the fact that China studies has been an importing field, not an exporting field. So finally, let me come to the 6th generation, 2012 to the present, which I call the new neo-totalitarian era of Xi Jinping's rule. And the scholarship over the last period of time, 13 years, has reflected the different elements of Xi Jinping's rule: his personal dictatorial dominance in all domains, the re-strengthening of the party, widespread repression against multiple sectors of society, the surveillance state and total information control, a renewed emphasis on Marxist ideology, prickly nationalism and wolf warrior public diplomacy, China's search for soft power, and its so-called assertive foreign policy, and its military modernization. These and increasing intimidation of Taiwan. Cross-strait studies have really characterized this period too. So over the last decade, 13 years, scholars have written about all of these topics. But overall, I would say there's been a paradigm shift from soft authoritarianism to what I call neo-totalitarianism, because I think it has a number of the features of the 1950s. And the research environment today, and here I'll begin to sort of wrap up and turn to the present and perhaps a few thoughts on the future. The research environment under Xi to this day is very, very fraught. The strict national security laws and regulations, a series of them have been issued that are really seriously and negatively affecting foreign attempts to do research in that society. And thus, ironically, the field, just to tell you what the subtitle of tonight's lecture is, Coming Full Circle, question mark. The insinuation there is that here we are in the 2020s, going back to, in some ways, the way we studied China in the 1950s and 60s, from outside, without on-the-ground opportunities, and using some of the methods of that earlier era. One consequence of this new, very unfortunate environment is tightened access to source materials and data inside of China, but so we can't get there. We can't do the research in situ. I guess if there is good news in this regard, is that unlike the 1950s and 60s, there's an enormous body of materials physically outside of China and available on the internet. There are some very substantial collections here at the ANU, in the Fairbank Center at Harvard, in George Washington University. I've started 20 years ago something called the China Documentation Center. We now have over 10,000 hard copy volumes and 5,000 journals, many of them NABU, many highly sensitive in a variety of fields. So that's good news, but it means that we're working from, again, printed materials rather than humans and participant observation. But the other dimension of the Xi period is that opportunities for research inside of China have not only contracted, but they're now subject to real dangers. Security, 安全, 国家安全, is now paramount in all policy spheres. And this very much applies to the academic sphere. In April 2023, the regime amended its 2014 counter-espionage law. And the new law dramatically expands the range of foreign activities in China that the authorities can investigate and prosecute. The foreign business community is impacted by this law. All foreigners are impacted by this law, but certainly includes foreign scholars. This new draconian environment has real implications for the selection of research topics, not just the ability to carry out research, but there are a whole number of topics that are just verboten, they're off limits. Don't try and research the Uyghurs or a number of other topics, because you never know. The elasticity of the term 国家安全 is so broad and so elastic and so vague that it can apply to anything. You can study kindergartens and nursery school, 托儿所, and there will be some national security element of 托儿所 that the regime could find and incarcerate you for. So China has really significantly closed up under Xi, reversing, obviously, the opening up of the previous decades. PRC government apparently does not want foreign scholars snooping around and conducting research. It's that simple. I don't know the numbers. In the United States, we only have 800 American students in China today. I would be surprised if there are 50. I would be surprised if there are 30, maybe even 20 scholars doing research on the ground in China. Think about that. But for professors, this has real implications for our PhD students in particular, or MA students, and how we counsel them on their topic selection. And even whether they go to China and risk the real possibility of arrest and detention. It is not professionally ethical, I feel, for professors to not offer stern warnings or even stop students from following their own risky inclinations. Oh, I'll be fine. One thing we do know, or I think, I've had a debate about this with my colleague Andy Walder recently, who doesn't share this view, but I think one should not go to China unless you are institutionally sponsored with an F visa, F for Fang Wen. Do not go into that country on an L visa, Luyo, as a tourist. You are really risking detention and you are violating the law. And if they want to pick you up for something else and you happen to be on an L visa, that's a nice excuse. And there are, unfortunately, a number of my colleagues that have still 10-year L visas that they got, and they will go into China on these. I think that's really ill-advised. So the research environment has fundamentally changed, and much for the worse. And I think it's incumbent upon all researchers and professors to familiarize themselves with this new and risky environment and not take such risks. Now, if there is any silver lining to this, is that the study of China's foreign relations has never been better. Why? Because you don't need to go to China to study China's activities abroad. And China is now all over the planet. There are all kinds of interesting foreign relations topics to study. Domestic China, yo wenti, but da wenti. But foreign policy, wide open, folks. Okay, let me just finish. Now, you might wonder about, is there demand? What's the situation in American universities? Are there enough students? Do we have enough student demand for our courses? Do we have enough professors to teach the courses? Good news is yes to both. Very strong demand. Slightly less on the language side, but for China courses across the social sciences, still very strong. Across, to my knowledge, across many universities, my own included. And the reservoir of knowledge about China inside the academy is very deep, very substantial, highly granular. It's a good thing and a bad thing. We know more and more details, but the ivory tower, as I say, is still very isolated when it comes to China studies. It's not playing its appropriate professional role. We have a good, sort of pipeline of doctoral students coming through. It's very difficult for them, they have to pick topics that can be researched outside of China. Taiwan has come back, just as it was in the 60s, as a place for language study. Oh boy, that's where everybody's going for language study now, back to Taipei or elsewhere. And even for research. So in the United States, There's strong demand. Every university and college, state universities, smaller liberal arts college, they all have China faculty and China courses. Now, lastly, maybe the new, rather adversarial, quasi-adversarial, competitive relationship between the United States and China will have the same effect on the field that it did on the Slavic studies, Soviet studies field in the 50s and 60s during Cold War 1.0, namely an impetus, know your enemy, so to speak. It's a little too early to say, but I think that there may be some side effects from that. One is that if you want to work in the US government and you've been to China to study language for a summer or whatever, you cannot get a security clearance. It's really difficult unless you go to one of three institutions: Yenjing Academy at Beida, Schwartzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua, or the Hopkins Nanjing Center. Those three, the American intelligence community and government seem to not be so troubled about. But it's difficult. So that's my overall. I'll stop there, Ben. I'm sorry, I've gone on probably longer than the allotted. No, it's been about an hour. Hey. Well, thank you very much.